Marc-Andre Argentino is a PhD candidate in Concordia University. His research examines how extremist groups leverage technology to create propaganda, recruit members to ideological causes, inspire acts of violence, and impact democratic institutions. He has a master's from Université Laval and a BA from Concordia. Marc-Andre is an associate fellow at the Global Network on Extremism in Technology and an associate researcher at CFER, the Center for Expertise and Training on Religious Fundamentalism and Radicalization. So Marc-Andre, thanks for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to talking QAnon with you guys.
Awesome. Yeah. So kind of have to admit that, my perspective of QAnon was something I definitely overlooked. I kind of thought it was just like this random sort of aspect of online conspiracy theory. And, I guess like sort of like really hardcore Trump supporters, but it was really nothing more than kind of this harmless movement. But I think for a lot of people, the Capitol riots on the 6th kind of changed that perspective. So for someone who really is ignorant of what Q is, can you describe kind of succinctly, like, what is QAnon? What is the idea of Q?
Yeah, sure. And honestly, like, even just before you give the definition, QAnon was a fringe ideology. Like, initially in my PhD, I was going to look at multiple groups and how they use technology and ideology. So I had started with ISIS. I was going to look at, neo-Nazi movements, white power movements, incels, and QAnon was an example of like conspiracy theories that could become a threat long-term. And, that's when I started looking at QAnon in 2018, but the pandemic really changed everything. And now this is why I have a whole PhD on QAnon, because it's grown so much. So I guess the short and sweet definition is that QAnon is a decentralized violent ideology that's rooted in an unfounded conspiracy theory that a globally active deep state of satanic pedophiles are responsible for all the evil in the world. And basically adherents of QAnon believe that this same cabal is seeking to bring down President Trump, or former President Trump now, whom they saw as the world's only hope in defeating it. And the name QAnon refers to Q, which is a top secret military operation geared towards supporting the President Trump. And Q is actually a real top secret clearance for the Department of Energy in the United States. So it's the department that's responsible for like topics around nuclear codes and missiles and launches and all that type of stuff. So basically, it's broken up, like there's QAnon USA and there's obviously QAnon International. So QAnon adherents in the US believe that the USA was the first country to awaken and tackle their own deep state. But international QAnon kind of believe that every country has their own deep state. So in the Canadian context, they believe that Prime Minister Trudeau, who's been mentioned by Q in the drop several times, is part of our own deep state here, and he needs to be removed to liberate Canada from all the evil people controlling our country. So I've found QAnon in about 85 countries so far, and that's the quick and dirty gist of what is QAnon.
Yeah. Okay. So besides America, where else would it be like the most prevalent? Like how prevalent is it here in Canada? Because I think it was last year when we had a Manitoban actually storm Rideau Hall, and I believe he was like a big QAnon supporter, and that kind of made a lot of Canadians wake up and realize, okay, there's something more going on here.
Yeah. So Corey Huron was a conspiracy theorist more than a QAnon believer. He did have one post on his Instagram page where he shared a picture of Q and a white rabbit, but he was really more into like the COVID conspiracy theories, especially around Event 201 and Bill Gates, and mainly because his grievances were his business were highly affected by the economic sanctions or the economic impact of the pandemic. So it was revealed later on that he actually was losing his business, which was his livelihood and everything. And I think that's what more led him to act, really, in the sense that the Liberal government were the ones that were responsible to manage the COVID affair, and that's what led him to act. The conspiracy theories were just a vector by which to target his grievances. Conspiracy theories do that. It's really about a battle between good and evil. And for them, it's the evil was targeted at the government at hand because they're the ones that are mismanaging the pandemic. And this is what led him to there. But he was the first example, or one of the first examples of the impact of conspiracy theories and violence. The other one were the couple from Quebec who actually burned down 4G towers thinking they were 5G towers. And again, this is where you have this weird blend of QAnon and other conspiracy theories where they were in this type of QAnon adjacent environment, but it was really about the 5G conspiracy theories that led them to damage 2 cell towers. And they're going through their court, the court system in Quebec right now for those events. So we basically, from the perspective of Canada, we've seen, one commit an act of violence and one do material damage to Canadian infrastructure, which shows how, conspiracy theories can motivate people to take actions that is closer to what we would see with a traditional terrorist threat.
I'm just curious. You said earlier that it had kind of you had been kind of studying it as a bit more fringe, and now suddenly it's kind of exploded in popularity because of the pandemic. Do you mind expounding on that? Why has it become so popular during this kind of period?
So just before 2020, QAnon had taken a big blow following the Christchurch terrorist incident, right? 8chan, where QAnon was posting, got shut down because that's where the manifestos and the videos and everything was happening. So between the Christchurch incident and the month of November, so July to November, there was no place for Q to post it. There was a 3-month period where there was no activity and content, and it had a huge impact on the community up until 8kun came back up. And even in February, the movement had almost no activity. Just looking at Facebook data as an example, prior to March 2020, when all the lockdowns really started and the borders closed, QAnon had 220,000 members in groups and about 200,000 members in pages. And this is aggregate. So what that means is that if there's, let's say, 50 QAnon groups and I join all 50 of them, I would be counted 50 times. So it doesn't really give a good count of people. But what happened was basically as of March 12th to July 2020, when the platforms first took action, especially Facebook against QAnon, it had grown from 400,000 members to 4.1 million members in aggregate. So that's a 5,300% increase in membership. And it was really tied to how QAnon was promoting conspiracy theories around the pandemic. And they started in January when we first heard about the virus in China, and they were promoting, you could drink bleach to cure and protect yourself from the flu and the virus, or it's a way to control the population. And, you really saw that as of March 12th in the US and Canada, they really started growing. And as of May, after the big pandemic hit, the pandemic really hit Spain and Italy, you saw international QAnon really grow as well when Europe was coming out of lockdown. So there's at least a possible correlation between the impact of the pandemic and the growth of QAnon. I'd almost want to say there's a direct causation, but that's very difficult to judge just with social media data. But with the way that we've seen the movement grow, it would be hard to deny the role of the pandemic. And you could link that with other far-right groups that will become more vocal and more active during this period.
Yeah, it kind of seems too in terms of the conspiratorial aspect, it's like a catch-all group for anyone who kind of has that belief system or that background. But kind of curious, hypothetically, let's say 2 years ago, if I would have started researching or looking into Q, what would be something that would drive someone towards it? Does it start off something light, kind of I wouldn't say light, but let's say something that a lot of people are aware of, sort of the 9/11 conspiracy theories or the JFK conspiracy theories? How does someone kind of enter the rabbit hole?
For most of the QAnon population prior to 2020, I would have assumed that they would fit within the boomer style population. It wasn't really a young audience. So a lot of the initial conspiracy theories are, and even most of the ones today, are linked to conspiracy theories that have been popular in the United States dating back to the 50s in reality. And it's really things that have been familiar, and these groups have been around since, we think online, at least since 9/11, the truther movement was massive on messaging board and image boards and all that. And they've been able to really congregate in these spaces, but it was very niche. You're looking at, boards on 8chan and 8kun that were getting a few hundred posts, maybe a few thousand posts a month. And it was active, but it wasn't massive, but it was always promoting, anti-Semitism. It was promoting violence. It was anti-establishment, anti-government. So it had all the markers that if someone would fall down that rabbit hole, they could be, more likely to follow into more extreme movements because you're fitting all these type of narratives. But it's also an entry point in the sense that they believe they were in a digital war and not a real one. So it's, at its core, it was nonviolent, but what it does is that it presents itself with markers of ideologies that are violent. So even though you'd say I'm an information war, well, if the information war fails or something happens that creates a grievance in this individual, they're already primed towards action more so than someone who would not be in these circles. And this is kind of what we saw with the pandemic, where individuals in here were primed for action because they had all the the indoctrination in a way into these violent ideologies. So when they were able to join with anti-maskers, anti-lockdowns, anti-government people who were going to the streets, they started coming together. So you saw QAnon borrow tropes from the Boogaloo movement, borrow tropes from the militias, borrow tropes from the preppers, and that overlap between these communities have been growing more and more. Ahead of the inauguration, there was a lot of content that was echoing the sovereign citizen movement. So you're really seeing how these spaces are starting to come together. And this is at its core, conspiracy theories are a way to explain away very complex situations. And it's really about explaining the problem of evil. So if you have something that's very complex, like child trafficking, which is a result of various societal factors, various government practices or legal restrictions, or even the challenge of being able to monitor, track, and find child abusers and pedophiles online because of how they operate, it's a lot more difficult to accept and wonder why we're not doing more to prevent this. But if you say that, oh, well, no one's doing anything about it because the elites in the government are letting it happen because they're benefiting from this, it's an easier explanation to swallow. The same way that, oh, well, Bill Gates, George Soros, and China were responsible for the vaccine as a way of controlling the population of the world and bringing it down. It provides explanation to very complex scenarios. And when the government says, let's say with the virus, it was like, oh, well, don't wear a mask because they won't work. Or, oh, we have more information about what type of virus is. Now you need to wear a mask. Or we don't need to social distance, and we need to social distance because the governments were learning on the fly. A conspiracy theory about the pandemic was consistent in a way. It always provided a similar answer that a specific group of people were responsible for this. So it provides comfort in very uncertain times, and it kind of becomes this crowdsourced master narrative with a bunch of other people who are uncertain about these times. So you also have community building around these ideas, and this is what brings people in. So you had stuff like a contentious election in 2016, and this movement grew out of Pizzagate. So you already had people who already were familiar with the child trafficking narratives. And then you had those who voted for President Trump were realizing that actually people were saying he was voted in by foreign actors. It was not a real election. And for them, they were seeing their victory being targeted by the elites they believe were responsible for child trafficking and all these other harms. So they were being able to explain all these complex scenarios by reducing it to a conspiracy theory in this master narrative, rather than trying to understand the complexities of geopolitics. So this is how it offers something to the community.
On the topic of kind of this idea of like a meta narrative that you were talking about, something to explain basically everything, I was reading some of your work and you described it as like a hyper-real religion. Like, for those who are kind of not familiar with it, I mean, I don't really know all that much. Like, what does that mean in the context of a conspiracy theory? Like, how could it be like a religion?
So QAnon started as a conspiracy theory in 2017 and 2018. But as it became mainstream, especially in 2020, it's really become a religio-political ideology. So what I mean by a hyperreal religion is this is based on the premise that pop culture shapes and creates our actual reality. An example of this could be something like, let's say, Jediism or Matrixism, right? Jediism started as a joke online where a bunch of people in the UK were saying, if we get 300,000 people to put this on the census, they'll recognize it as a real religion. But years later, the ideological and ethical frameworks of Jediism are being applied by these communities as a way for them to practice and, live out their lives in an ethical framework. So it provides a way by which they could receive pop culture in a parallel to religious tradition. So what we're seeing with QAnon is they openly use popular culture, they use media, and they definitely borrow heavily from American evangelicalism in countries that are not very secular. And this is what forms their religious and political ideology. So QAnon adherents consume Q drops. They construct and make meaning from this, and this redefines their meaning within their society. And this is what creates this parallel to religious tradition. So QAnon adherents are not passive readers. They're not just, consuming this content and doing nothing. They're content creators. They generate memes and videos. This feeds the information war. This feeds, as we saw on January 6th, offline actions. It impacted their behaviors. So like I was saying, like the discourse between religion and conspiracies are linked by this function. Both permit the development of symbolic resources that, address the problem of evil. So events are not random, but they also give QAnon believers an identification of evil and a definable enemy for which they could fight against and struggle against. So basically what happens is QAnon attempts to explain evil, and it's really about the concept of theodicy, the problem of evil. It's a concept we have in religious studies where people are trying to explain away the problem of evil. Why would this massive force permit all these issues to happen? Well, QAnon offers its adherents comfort in these uncertain times, whether it's war, child trafficking, a pandemic, economic strife, political strife, and it provides them solace. And this is what creates their worldview. And it's very characterized by this sharp distinction between the realms of good and evil. It's black and white. There is really no gray. And, they really perceive themselves as fighting into this war, and they see Q drops as something that's testable and accumulatable by evidence. It's very similar to how you'll see Christians or, Jews or Muslims or Hindus really turn back to holy texts as a way of explaining away what's happening in the world. They're justifying actions in the real world. So what's happening is that the more sweeping these conspiracy theories are, the less relevant evidence become. And it's really about faith. It's really about faith in Q, in Trump, and those around Trump who are part of Q team. So it's really not about asking the question, why do people believe this? These people are crazy. These are the answers that people are going to go when they're not trying to understand a movement. But I've embedded myself in these communities for 2.5 years now. And the really more important question, especially from, studying ideological motivated by extremists, it's really about what are they doing with their belief? And January 6th is a stark example of how conspiracy theories go from online ideologies to offline violent actions. Because even though there was a host of groups that were active, at the forefront of the people pushing into Capitol Hill, chasing down police, were QAnon adherents. And this is really where I'm seeing it as an ideology, because this is not just, a conspiracy theory, because no one really shot up someone, a place, or raided the Capitol because they thought the moon landing was faked or that JFK was killed, right? You've seen QAnon adherents run political campaigns based on their belief in QAnon. You've seen QAnon adherents protest and march and organize themselves into political actions based on these ideologies. And you've seen people commit violent crimes. So it's really more than just, I think there's these shadowy actors. It's really become a construct by which these individuals perceive the world, and their behaviors are modified and impacted by this belief.
It's kind of a scary aspect to think of it as that, because then how do you even have these people kind of take a step back and realize, okay, I went too far, when they start viewing it as some sort of religious aspect? Like, I was talking to Jatar, he was saying that, for him, the drops kept moving and then the goalposts move. And then one day he kind of realized, okay, I've just been kind of running along the whole time. But I was looking on Twitter today and I'm seeing people posting things saying like, oh, do you still believe? Because I believe. And now it seems like, nothing happened. Well, something happened on the 6th with the riots, but in terms of Pence not certifying the Electoral College. So then it goes to the 20th where it's like, okay, well, Biden won't be sworn in as president. And I assume that's going to drive a lot of people away from it. But then also you have people saying, okay, well, no, now something's going to happen on the 4th. So like, how far does this go? That's kind of what I'm interested in.
So it's scary in the sense to see that they've become an ideology, but from a research perspective, or even from a threat assessment perspective, we have tools in counterterrorism toolkits to address ideological movements. it just needs to be realized that it's not just a bunch of crazy people with tinfoil hats living in their basements. So what's happening is they're an apocalyptic movement. They're millenarial. They really believe that there's going to be this apocalyptic event. There's going to be a huge amount of suffering, but they're the chosen ones that will make it through. And then there's this big promised golden age where you're going to have, free technology, cures to all these diseases, unlimited wealth. So the goalpost could be moved infinitely in a sense, as most religions have. Christians have been pushing the goalpost on the apocalypse for 2,000 years. Now, I don't think QAnon is going to become anything like Christianity, but apocalyptic movements have existed and gone for, thousands of years. They're not going to go away. And even if QAnon would disappear, the problem is that the believers still have this core necessity to believe in something. It doesn't address the inherent need of these individuals, and they're going to go and find it somewhere else. So this is, for them, it's really about trying to explain what is going around them. And, if it wasn't for QAnon, maybe they would have become Christian or Muslim or Jewish or, joined the Jehovah's Witness or Little League or whatever. They needed a medium by which to explain what's happening to them. And this is what they fell upon. If there were other safety nets or other resources, maybe they would have fallen to these other sectors. So it's really about addressing these issues. Until they're addressed, this is really going to go on indefinitely. It might not be as QAnon, but it'll be as other movements that is providing these individuals with the answers that they need.
I'm curious if you think, especially with the migration of a lot of followers off Twitter and mainstream platforms towards like Parler, I know Parler shut down, but like Telegram and Gab, does that kind of provide a large group for like accelerationist groups and further far right groups to recruit out of?
Yeah, that's one of the big concerns when you're looking at stuff like deplatforming, especially when the deplatforming happened. So there is always a need to remove these individuals from the platform. The problem is that this could have been done months ago before damage was done. So because it took bodies on the ground, this really all happened before an inauguration. So what you're pushing is, a large group of people. When you're looking at where the influencers, like the biggest Telegram channel they created, where all the influencers are admin, they have 130,000 people in that group right now that all joined within 10 days. And what happened is that all these people saw their prophetic apocalypse fail. So now they're in these very vulnerable positions where they need to try to come to terms with this. So they're going through these stages of griefs. When they joined Telegram, the first thing I saw is that when I jumped on Telegram, which is basically where all the real extremists hang out on Telegram, they were already talking about, we have all these MAGA conspiracy theorists, normie conservatives coming to our platform. They're basically saying, don't hit them over the head with all the, Civil War hammer and whatever else you need. They use a lot more racist terms when they were trying to describe what they were doing, right? But they say, don't hit them over the head with all the racist stuff, the war stuff, and slowly bring them in, really push the narrative that there is no political solution. And then you'll slowly be able to bring them in. And what we saw was, as of noon yesterday, some of these far right channels were, quote unquote, raiding QAnon channels. And you saw just a bunch of people start joining these QAnon channels and sharing, messed up, there is no political solution, trying to radicalize them further, making them angry. Even saw some sharing, Siege and Turner Diaries and other books that I'm not going to name because people shouldn't be reading them. But, they were really pushing these type of manifestos and manuals, whereby a lot of people on the far right, use these as a way of educating and training themselves and radicalizing themselves and making a plan on how they would go about the second Civil War. So, this is, you saw that they were already prepared. Now, I don't think there's going to be a massive exodus from QAnon to these more extreme movements. But when your audience pool, when you're thinking about like Telegram channels have anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand people, and you have Telegram channels with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of followers, your audience has grown exponentially for these people. So even if your success rate was, let's say, 1%, well, if your channel has 1,000 people, that's maybe 10 people you're recruiting. Well, at 100,000, you're recruiting 10,000 people. So you're really, you have your opportunity to bring in people to your cause is greater. So in the long term, there's a probability that we might see a growth in ideologically motivated violent extremists. And these are transnational communities. This is not just American centric. They were recruiting from QAnon channels around the world. That's QAnon Canada, in France, Spain, Italy, Germany, Australia, New Zealand. Like, all of our partners and allies, all of the countries where we travel frequently to, are all part of this. And there's nothing suspicious about let's say a French Canadian traveling to France. Well, on Telegram, on a French QAnon Telegram channel in December, they were talking about paramilitary training they were doing in like the country of France, in like the middle of nowhere. Like, oh, I have a farm, I have a gun range that I'm building, I'm ex-military, and they're just like, oh, I'm ex-gendarmerie and I'm ex-EMT and all these, and they're like, we're all ex-trained individuals and come and we're going to teach you how to fight. Well, when it comes to like your CT toolkit, unless you already have these individuals on the radar, there's nothing going to be weird if, let's say, a Marc-Andre Argentino from Quebec travels to Paris, France, and I rent the car and I go about. The amount of Quebecers that travel to France, there's nothing weird. The amount of Americans that go to France, there's nothing weird. It's a typical tourist destination. So it's not, there's no red flags like, oh, I'm going to, take a plane to Turkey and then jump the border to go to Syria. There's more red flags if you're going to go there. So, the markers and the concerns are quite different in this environment, because all in all, these are quote unquote normies in the space. However, they are potentially going to be radicalized into these more violent ideologies. Now, when it comes from an operational security perspective, they're not that bright. These are all public channels. It's all quite observable, but limited resources when it comes to our law enforcement intelligence agencies being able to try to pick a needle out of a pile of needles and determining which one's going to prick you, not an easy task. So the chance of them falling through, the system is quite likely.
Yeah, I think kind of researching like Telegram last year, when I first looked at it, it blew me away, because I've never seen any content like that. And frankly, I was like, oh my goodness, like this is actually pretty scary. But then, after looking at it for a bit longer, I kind of get the perspective like these guys are total tools, to be honest. But then the other thing is those are the public channels. So I'm kind of curious what goes on the ones that are actually more secretive. But that being said, I'm kind of curious about the linkages between the rhetoric on like the far right, like neo-Nazi channels versus Q, because you kind of referenced how you have that anti-Semitism. And so I'm curious if like on the Q, there's a lot of, I guess, dog whistling in the sense, while on the far right channels, it's just absolute overt, racism.
So there's definitely a lot of dog whistling. And I think the easiest example would be Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was elected to Congress. From her representative account, her first post on Twitter was a dog whistle of the 14 words. So it was just like there's really no other way to accidentally like interpret what she said. So there's definitely some connections to the far right. There's already been some incidents in the month of May. There was an individual called Benjamin Hung who was arrested in California, and he was a 3%er QAnon adherent, and he drove his pickup truck through a crowd of BLM protesters, and he was arrested, and they're looking at his messages, and he was planning on making explosives. He had a cache of weapons, and he was like organizing within his 3%er community, but they were perceiving the threat through the storm and basically that's the apocalyptic event predicted in QAnon. So you saw that there's this overlap between 3%ers. One of the individuals who was part of the kidnapping plot of the governor of Michigan was a QAnon adherent, or at least QAnon adjacent, really into the Save the Children type narratives that were popular at the time when that plot was happening. I've seen evidence of white power QAnon, neo-Nazi QAnon, militia movements. Like it's present, and the challenge is that a lot of this stuff relate to the core of the conspiracy that deep state cabal controlled by satanic pedophiles that feed on the blood of children. That's really linked to blood libel and the elder protocols of Zion. So depending on where you are in the far right ecosystem, you might just perceive this as a conspiracy theory. But if you're already in a more far right, white nationalist, neo-Nazi space, you believe in the Zionist occupied government, the blood libel and like Jewish element of this really fall more into the anti-Semitic space, scapegoating the Rothschilds, scapegoating the Soros. Yes, they scapegoat a bunch of other people who are not Jewish, but these individuals feature prominently. So when you're putting in these far-right space, when you move to Telegram, it's easier to make this connection towards an anti-Semitic narrative. And like, if you go on 8kun and you go to the QAnon boards, the anti-Semitism is straight up. Like, every media outlet CEO posted with a Star of David next to their name. The meme of the cartoonish meme of the Jewish person with the long nose and the crooked hands and the bag of monies are everywhere. It's just, it's part and parcel of the community. It's not going to be, Twitter QAnon or Instagram QAnon or Facebook QAnon, less so. But if you've been QAnon long and you're at the core of the movement, anti-Semitism is part of it, and that's an easy vector to radicalize people.
Yeah, it essentially lays the groundwork for the early foundation. That's crazy. Okay, the other thing I'm really interested in too is you referenced Marjorie Greene, and it seems like somehow this movement has become embedded in the grassroots Republican movement, and it's almost like a weird reincarnation of the Tea Party movement, except instead of conservatives, you're electing conservative conspiracy theorists. What's the deal with that? Like, how embedded would you say this movement is with sort of the Republican Party on local levels in the United States?
So it's probably more embedded than we know, but most of the data we have is really about the congressional candidates, and that was collected by Alex Kaplan at Media Matters. He did like the whole research around this on the candidates. He found 97. And like, it was really a crowdsourced project of his, but it really showed how they made it mainstream. And he had 97 candidates out of 435 seats. That's still a decent amount of people. He had seen about 23 candidates at the state level, but he didn't dig deeper. And then now there's stories about a mayor in somewhere who's running for office who's been elected, and he's a QAnon believer. In Saskatchewan, we had one candidate who was running for the provincial election who had to step down when he came to light that he was a QAnon believer, posting content all over his Facebook page. So at the city level, it's very likely it's just something that's not covered in the big press or online. So unless you are aware of QAnon and you're aware of your local politics, you're not really going to catch it. And where I live, I don't even know what my city politics are. I'm not paying attention to them. So it's not something that's very easy to do. And there's no really reporting mechanisms for these type of things unless someone's paying attention. And that's a gap in a way. So they're probably way more present than we believe. And looking at the fallout of this and all the stories of, oh, my mother is believing in this, or, I have a sibling who believes this, or my DMs are filled all the time with X person in my life believes in this. What can I do? Or they're saying this. Do you know what this means? So I could engage with them. And I'm pretty sure it's a little more widespread than what we would assess it to be. But the challenge is, like, no one's really going to say, I'm a QAnon believer, and no one knows going to admit, oh, my spouse or my brother's a QAnon believer. There's a level of embarrassment tied to it on both sides.
So with all those like challenges you mentioned with people not wanting to speak up about it, especially because of the stigma perhaps spurred on by the Capitol riots too, a lot of people are kind of looking down on it. Like, is there any way to like reach out to these people in any way and like de-radicalize them, for lack of a better term?
There's a lot of opportunities to reach out to these people. The problem is, and the biggest one really is about the stigma, in the sense that, the top comment I get every time I do a thread trying to explain QAnon, make sense of what they're saying, is, oh, these people are crazy. And that's the biggest challenge. No one's going to come out and really talk about this if the first label you're going to give to them is crazy. The 99.9% of these people do not have a mental illness, right? So it's not really about being crazy. Some of these people are lawyers and doctors and professionals and elected officials. It's not about, these typical elements that we would see, and people are quite concerned about how they're going to be labeled. The other challenge is people do not want to have conversations with conspiracy theorists because I get this fact, like, it doesn't make sense. How could you believe something that's so stupid? It doesn't make sense. If you want to approach someone, the first thing is really about empathy and being available to listen. It's trying to understand, why do you believe in this? So you let them speak, you listen to what they have to believe, because there's a reason why they join these movements. And you try to get to the crux of what it is. Are you concerned because you lost a business? Are you depressed? Are you going through X, Y, and Z that might have led you down this path? And when you're able to build a relationship with them over time, when they trust you, you're able to slowly introduce elements that, oh, well, Q or QAnon influencers are saying X, Y, and Z. At the root of what you're saying, this is actually true. Here's another source that actually confirms that point, what you believe. The stuff around the periphery might not be true, but the core element is. And it's really trying to build those elements and use those building blocks to slowly bring them out of it. You're not gonna, there's not much quitting cold turkey. It could happen, but most people are not. They're in there for a reason. And it's also, they built a community. So how do you replace the community of friends who confirm their biases if you're going to mock them and call them crazy? Why are they going to want to engage with you if you're just going to push them aside? And that's something that's very challenging if someone in your family is a racist, anti-Semitic, QAnon believer, and your partner's Jewish, let's say. It's going to be hard for you to have those conversations, and it's not possible to have them with everyone. But I think right now at this time, I think having empathy and trying to be open and available to talk to people is a way to do it. And I try to engage as much as possible with QAnon believers who are willing to have a conversation. A lot of them aren't, but if they're willing to come and message me, even actually ask questions and try to red pill me and have a conversation, it happens. It works, but I could talk with them and try to explain and give them resources to think through what they believe and have them question what they believe. There's no real magic recipe for de-radicalization. You can talk to most formers that have gone through the process, and they all have individual reasons and stories as to why they came out of their belief. And it's going to be the same thing with QAnon, but it's having a series of resources and safety nets available to support these individuals, but also have a willing QAnon believer who may be willing to talk about it, and having someone who is close to them or someone who they're willing to talk to, build this relationship and trust them. Because if you're just going to mock them and push them aside, no one's going to want to get out of a movement into another community that's not going to support them.
I think the other aspect too that I'm curious to hear your perspective on is, how do you even question your movement when the most powerful man in the world, the president of the United States, panders to your group? Like, that just, to me, it blows my mind, because frankly, I never would think in a million years that I would see what happened on the 6th. It was honestly the most historically important day of my young life so far. But in terms of the president just going along for political gain, which obviously wasn't much of a gain in the end, but how important is sort of Trump's pandering towards this group and not condemning them and saying, listen, this isn't real? How does that push supporters further?
I hate using this example, but I think it's the best example to use, is 1933, burning of the Reichstag. Hitler pandered to a specific group of individuals that, they had someone who was looking to run for office who had been elected, listen to them and leverage them and support them and give them the resources they need to achieve their objectives. It was during a period of crisis, post-World War I. There was a lot of economic suffering, there was political suffering, there was a lot of insecurities. Trump was doing the same thing. It's a pandemic year, there's a lot of contentious issues. He had lost an election, and he was trying to do what he can. It was an attempted fascist coup. And historically, people from our generation, I remember, we all had the questions how could people let Hitler come to power? How could they let them do that to Jews? We just saw our neighbors to the south let an individual almost have a fascist coup. And these were people within his own party. People on the other side of the party didn't do much. They didn't speak out as much as they could have. Right? There's a lot of blame across the board to just let this happen, and the complacency of individuals which led this. But the fact that he pandered to a group of people who worshipped him is not surprising. And the consequence of that is what we saw on January 6th. He was elected, and a year later, we had Charlottesville. There was a platform that was permissive of racist narratives and far-right movements, where They were able to openly speak about things that they were not before. You know, the consequence of that is what happened on January 6th. And it's more than just 4 years. There has been decades of, you know, geopolitical, domestic, and other circumstances that had led to the growth in far-right movements and have emboldened them. But the fact that the president was pandering to them definitely had an impact.
So to kind of jump off what you were saying, like, do you think that if Trump was to outright denounce the movement or to question its legitimacy, do you think it would in effect kind of de-radicalize people or kind of make people not believe so strenuously in QAnon, or do you think it's past that point now and it's more than just Trump?
So it would have an impact in the sense that some people will definitely be disillusioned and they would leave. The problem is that the mechanisms by which QAnon functions, because it's this secret military operation, for them, if Trump does something publicly, it's about optics. It's part of the plan. It's part of the movie they're watching. So when he said that, when he kind of had his concession speech, that wasn't really a concession speech, they read into it, say, oh, he didn't say that the transfer of power was going to Biden. So it's part of the plan. He's not saying the whole message. So there's always ways for the hardcore believers to, you know, question away any of the possible messages that President Trump would say or former President Trump would say. So but you know, low-hanging fruits, individuals who are not as committed, individuals who are new to the movement, definitely would fall out, but it wouldn't be effective on everyone in them. And honestly, at this point, with him now no longer in the seat of power, I don't know if the impact would be as great as it would have been 6 months ago, right? So at this point, they kind of reached their objective. They saw what happened on January 6th, and then anything that would happen after that is just a way of protecting yourselves from the consequences of what happened.
So in terms of these like Q drops, I think it's kind of reading on Twitter that there hasn't been a drop since like December 3rd or something. And now essentially the movement itself has just become like self-sufficient, where it's just relying among community members. Can you talk to that a little?
Yes, the last drop from Q was on December 8th, 2020. And you don't really need to have any more Q drops. Like, Q doesn't need to exist anymore. He doesn't need to post. You've had influencers who are reinterpreting these texts and finding new meanings. And it's kind of almost like, you know, biblical criticism in the sense that you're like, the Bible hasn't had any new chapters. Christians are still interpreting the text. Muslims haven't had, you know, a new Quran. They're still interpreting the text. So you're really looking at these, it's basically a holy text for them, and you could reinterpret. So you saw that Eric Trump posted a message at 5:14 p.m. and they're like, oh, drop 5:14 says storm is coming. So they're making these correlations, they connection, and like any holy text, you could reinterpret it any way you want. Like, if you throw enough spaghetti at a wall, something's going to stick eventually. And this is what happened. So you could reinterpret them. You could find new meanings. You could, timestamp, code words, whatever happens. They haven't looked at every single word to find an answer. Because they're so cryptic, you could attribute any meaning to anything in a Q drop.
Yeah. Really interesting though, because your background is in religious studies, right? Like your BA. So like, I don't think a majority of people would ever look at it through this lens, but it makes so much sense of how the movement took off and became so powerful, and how people are so resistant to change on it. Because frankly, I never would have guessed that. In terms of the origins of Q, are there any sort of guesses on who the individual who posted is? And I'm curious what the motives were, because I mean, to me, it almost seems like the perfect, really easy sort of like counter or espionage sort of movement, right? Because you could see what happened with Pizzagate and you kind of place it here. But I'm curious if it's, you know, an American national, or if it's sort of let's say a foreign agent or something.
Like, the origins of Q was so benign and so fringe that no one could have perceived the growth of QAnon, because no one could have predicted the pandemic. And the pandemic has had a huge impact on how QAnon has grown in the past year and how it's been mainstream. Because prior to March 2020, maybe 24 articles on QAnon, 36 articles in 3 years, and it was really about like people who have committed real acts of violence around QAnon, like the Bucky Wolf, who's a Proud Boy QAnon believer who stabbed his brother through the head with a sword, or the individual who brought an armored truck to the Hoover Dam and like was asking for to release the report on like the investigations, right? Like those flashy events caught the news, but before that, no one really cared. It was this really weird thing that people talked about. So unless you're listening to like QA or reading like Daily Beast or whatever, you're not really getting the full picture of this movement. So from like, it really did start as probably a LARP online. Like there is something called an Anon jar that's very popular on the chans, where people would come in and pretend to be, intelligence officials or government officials. And they have these secrets and they play the game, this role play, and then it dies out. This goes back to like, till the early internet, basically, when people were posting as different characters, and it's something that has always really existed. So it's not something that's unique to QAnon, and it did get mainstream mainly because of Tracy Beans, who talked about QAnon on her like YouTube channel that has 150,000 people. But even then, when it was mainstreamed on Reddit, initially it wasn't that big. They had maybe 70,000 members in the chats, in the subreddits at the time, before they were taken down for doxing people. Like, it was not a massive community. No one really paid attention to what they had, and it really was just a joke. Is it domestic? Well, if the rumors are true, it was started by an American and then someone from South Africa, so could in theory be international, but it was probably two dudes that were joking. There's probably been multiple users from Q, based on how the trip codes have changed and the type of language used by QAnon. Once it went to 8chan, all likelihood Jim and Ron Watkins were in control of the account. And even if they weren't directly posting as Q, because they own, like Jim owns 8kun and his son was administrator of the boards, they had full control. They basically permitted the people who controlled the Q account to function on their boards. They facilitated the whole movement, and they could really do what you want as an admin. You could change the timestamps, you could change the trip codes, you could do whatever you want on the back end, and no one would know on the front end. So it's very likely that they were the ones controlling the account towards the end of its life.
In your perspective, what's the future of QAnon? Let's say 5-10 years down the road, where is the movement headed?
I doubt there'll be QAnon in 5-10 years. In all likelihood, we're going to have either a core of individuals that will really harden into this conspiracy movement. I don't think they'll survive 10 years because there's going to be something else that will come along. Some of them will likely be recruited into more extremist movements. Some of them might turn to violent action because they're so disillusioned. Very unlikely, but there might be a couple of individuals who do that within the next year or so. But some of them might form a new religious movement. Maybe you'll see something like the Branch Davidians form around this, anti-government apocalyptic religious movement, right? Or some of them will just walk away from the movement. It's right now it's being balkanized in so many little subgroups that it's very hard to predict where they're going to go. But the core conspiratorial mindset is not going to go away. And that's the important element. The conspiracy theories and the far right kind of go hand in hand. They really function well together. So it's not something that's going to disappear, but I don't think in 5-10 years we're going to have something called QAnon. We'll have something else, but remnants of QAnon will definitely have evolved and morphed into something else, because at its core, the anti-Semitic, the anti-establishment ideas, the fact that global elites control the world are not new. The NWO was quite popular in the 90s. You had the black helicopters in the 80s. You had, Area 51 and government secrets with aliens. So there's all these government secrets, these ideas that have circulated for years and years, and it's not unique or new. So when you have conspiracies mirrored with massive political events, they come back to life. And you've seen that as we think of like Timothy McVeigh or Ruby Ridge or Waco. There's these religious or conspiratorial elements that all come together, and it'll definitely affect the belief system of these people for years to come, but probably under various different names.
What was I going to say here? So, kind of curious, is this sort of like a 2016 to 2020 phenomenon, or is the reason that this was able to take place was because of just the availability of the internet as a kind of facilitating agent, and you sort of had the perfect sort of storm come together in terms of like the Trump presidency and pandering? And is this something that is going to become like a fairly, not common force, but it's going to be sort of in the American mainstream mind for like the time going forward politically?
Like short term, it probably is going to be, but short term, it probably is going to be something that we're going to be dealing with. But these things are not unique, and the internet does not necessarily create them, but it facilitates their creation in the sense that the printing press facilitated specific conspiracy theories. Then it was radio, then it was television. So all these new technologies at the time presented various threats or various ways that hostile actors could leverage them. Internet is just a new means, and it's just faster and more effective than the older technologies were. But it doesn't mean that they're really at its heart. This is a human issue. These are human behaviors that are at work, and that's what's there. And then humans are just using the tools that's made available to them. So yes, there's more connections because let's say you wanted to get a conspiracy out before, maybe you had to share your VHSs or your CDs or your 54K dial-up to share a video. Like now you could upload videos every day on YouTube, and it takes no time. You could spend this day watching and reading comments. You could connect with people across the globe. So it does prevent new avenues for sharing this content, new connections, but the behaviors would still be there without the internet. But I think right now what's going to happen is as long as the pandemic is going on, as long as there's economic and political insecurities around the world, QAnon and other similar movements are going to thrive because people are trying to find answers as to what is happening. They're getting upset, they're frustrated, and this is how it's being expressed for some individuals. So up until the pandemic's gone, it's very hard to perceive what the world's going to be because this is definitely going to be a world-changing event, and we're living through it right now. So we don't know what the consequences of the long-term impact of this is going to be.
Okay, so we're approaching like almost an hour, and we don't want to take up like way too much of your time. We're already appreciative of how much you've taken for us. But I'd just like to ask one final question, and that is, do you think where would you like to see government policies and maybe policies from tech conglomerates go? Do you think they have a role in helping mitigate this extremism, or do you think it's kind of out of their hands?
So there's basically, to deal with something like QAnon is you need a multi-sectoral approach. It's still a movement that we're learning about right now, and you've seen platforms take action. So there is a need in a way for creating a data vault or a way of archiving this information so that researchers and experts could analyze it and pull lessons through on what to do with these movements. Platforms also need to be more consistent and basically be less reactive when it comes to how they're approaching these groups. It's a challenge because they're companies, and trust and safety teams are an expense. They don't generate money. So it's not the place that they're necessarily going to invest the most money because these teams are not as large as they could be. They might not have all the resources they need. They might not have all the expertise they need. And every time you ask for more resources, basically when you're going to your shareholders, it's like, oh, well, we're spending money here. And a lot of this stuff initially, like the first actions against QAnon, were really about PR. So there needs to be a more consistent approach. Companies now following January 6th have been very consistent in how they're approaching it. But again, that's a reactive event. Government need to probably consider how to have stronger safety nets to catch vulnerable individuals. A lot of this is related to insecurities around the pandemic, social polarization. With stronger safety nets and stronger resources for communities, there would be a way of preventing some of these. Now, a global pandemic is not something that people could really predict or prepare for, though I guarantee we're going to be now. But this is something that there needs to be for. And really right now, it's starting to put systems together to pull people out of these organizations, because you can't apply traditional de-radicalization programs to QAnon. They're not ISIS, but they're also not like white power KKK movements, though they are navigating those spaces now. They're really this in-between between, you know, a political and a religious extremist movement. And not everyone in QAnon is an extremist, but they have the potential, or not everyone in QAnon is a violent extremist, but as an extremist, you have a potential to become violent. And it's really providing resources for people to get out there, find other avenues, finding a way to reach out to them, having programs that they could be recommended to help them get out of these systems. So it's really maybe providing resources to organizations that already exist in the de-radicalization space, and then developing new tools and resources for people that fall within this more amorphous, nebulous extremist space.
All right, we want to thank you so much for your time today, Marc-Andre. I mean, I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure on behalf of our viewers, we want to thank you for taking your time to speak with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you guys for reaching out and inviting me. It's a lot of fun.